Hey guys, tonight we begin with the remarkable snacking habits of the ancient Egyptians. Legends who somehow managed to invent junk food before inventing forks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. So you're an average Egyptian, not a high priest. Not a pharaoh. Just a regular human in a linen kilt, trying to make it through the sweltering day without passing out into the Nile. You've spent the last 8 hours herding goats or hauling mud bricks, and now it's time for a snack. Maybe even a meal. You reach for the most reliable thing in your life. Bread. But don't get too excited. This isn't the fluffy, warm baguette of modern fantasy. This is Emma wheat bread. Thick, flat, and rough enough to give your gums a solid workout. Why? Because the ancient Egyptians ground their grain with stone, and by stone, we mean the entire desert floor. Every bite is a gamble. Is that crunch a grain of barley or a surprise shard of quartz? Either way, your dentist, if you had one, would be furious. Still, bread was everything. It was your main source of calories, the base of the food pyramid, and possibly part of the actual pyramid. You'd eat it at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and whenever you felt sad, which, given the heat, was often. And it wasn't just plain bread. You got creative. Some loaves were shaped like birds or fish, because nothing says festive like biting the head off a flower duck. Others were flavoured with things like coriander, dates, or even beer foam, because clearly someone said, what if bread but also intoxicated? The truth is, bread wasn't just food. It was currency, offering, and comfort food all in one. You could trade it, sacrifice it, leave it in a tomb for your afterlife lunchbox, and no matter how gritty, burnt, or dense it got, you'd still eat it. Why? Because you were Egyptian, and carbs were destiny. You're thirsty. But remember, this is ancient Egypt. Water is suspect. You've seen what happens upstream with hippos and questionable rituals. So, like everyone else, you reach for the safest beverage around, beer. But don't expect a cold pilsner with a citrusy finish. Your Egyptian beer isn't something you sip, it's something you commit to. It arrives in a wide ceramic jug, warm from the sun, thick enough to hold its own shape and full of floaters. You squint. Is that barley? Is that bread? Yes. Yes, it is. You see, beer back then was made by soaking loaves of half-baked bread in water, fermenting it with wild yeasts and maybe straining it if someone was feeling fancy. Most weren't. So what you got was a drinkable loaf, chunky, foamy, tangy, and about as elegant as drinking a swamp smoothie through a straw made of reeds. No carbonation, no clarity, no complaints. This wasn't just for tavern crawlers. Beer was everything. You drank it at breakfast. You gave it to your kids. You got it as wages if you were a worker. If you were building the pyramids, your daily payment was beer, roughly 4 litres of it. Nothing says employee of the month, like finishing your shift mildly buzzed and full of carbs. And don't worry, the gods were on board too. Temples brewed their own batches, some reserved for festivals, some for ritual offerings, and others, shockingly, just for priestly consumption. Apparently, divine service pairs well with a little barley haze. Now, don't mistake all this for poor taste. Egyptians loved this stuff. They wrote hymns about it. They painted scenes of it. They even had a goddess of beer, Tenenet. Yes, an actual divine figure whose job was to oversee childbirth and beer. Because why separate pain and pleasure? You've survived the stone-ground bread and chewed your beer like a champ. Now, you crave something truly indulgent. Something sweet, sticky, and possibly dangerous to your dental health. Enter the honey bomb. No, that's not a medieval weapon. It's dessert, Egyptian style. You shuffle toward the market stalls, where the air smells like roasted grain and ambition. A vendor offers you a warm handful of something golden and glistening. Fried dough, dripping with honey, probably shaped like an abstract bird. You don't ask questions. You just bite. Instant regret. followed by instant bliss. The outside is crispy, the inside soft, and the entire thing is drenched in honey like it lost a bet with a beehive. Your fingers stick together. Your jaw sticks shut. But your soul? Your soul briefly ascends to the field of reeds. You have just eaten a honey cake, or as modern historians call it, ancient Egypt's answer to the Twinkie, minus the shelf life, plastic, or shame. These sweets were everywhere. Weddings, religious festivals, funerals. Nothing said celebration like eating a dessert that could double as an adhesive. Some were made with dates mashed into a gooey paste, then rolled in nuts and dunked in honey. Others were more ambitious. Layered pastries, stuffed pastries, and pastries that dared you to guess if that crunch was a toasted almond or a rogue pebble from the baking pit. And honey wasn't just a sweetener. It was a gift from the gods. Literally. Bees were associated with Ra, the sun god, so eating honey was practically a form of worship. You're not just snacking, you're engaging in divine contact, with extra calories. Of course, only the wealthier folks got the real good stuff. As a middle-class goat herder with dreams, your honey bomb is probably a little light on the honey and a little heavy on the bread. But who cares? It's hot, sticky, and distracts you from the fact that your roof is made of mud and you've been cursed 3 times this week by local cats. It's hot. You're sticky. Your only relief from the sun is the shade of a papyrus stand and the promise of something sweet that won't require a mortar and pestle to digest. So you wander to a street vendor who greets you with a single word that changes everything. Dates. Not the romantic kind. Although, let's be honest, your chances of seducing a priestess are as dry as the Nile in midsummer. No, these are the wrinkly, sweet, desert-grown fruit that ancient Egyptians consumed in frankly suspicious quantities. You pick one up. It's soft, brown, slightly squishy. It looks like something a camel rejected, but smells like caramel with ambition. You bite in. Boom. Instant sugar rush. Your pupils dilate. Your jaw twitches. You feel alive again, until you realize you've eaten 5 in under a minute, and now you can hear the gods whispering to you through your molars. Welcome to date overload. Dates were ancient Egypt's answer to everything. Energy bar, dessert, digestive aid, seduction tactic, and sometimes possibly structural adhesive. They were mashed, dried, boiled, mixed with nuts, fried, or stuffed with honey, and left out in the sun until they reached the consistency of a brick made of joy. Some people mixed dates with barley flour and rolled them into little balls. Others turned them into syrup, a thick, dark goo they'd pour over bread, cakes, or during wild parties, possibly themselves. You don't ask questions at temple festivals. You just eat. Even scribes loved dates. Their ink may have faded, but the recipes stuck around. Medical papyri listed dates as cures for everything from constipation to general grumpiness. Coincidence? Probably not. You try being sad with a belly full of warm date cake, but there's a dark side. You're halfway through your 7th sticky orb when your stomach begins to ask questions your brain can't answer. You've overdone it. Again, your teeth ache, your tongue feels like it's been lacquered in syrup, and the local ibis is judging you. He saw everything. You stagger back to your mud brick home, sticky-fingered and glassy-eyed, whispering never again to the gods of indulgence. A lie they've heard before. But don't worry. Tomorrow, you'll be back at the vendor's stall. And so the cycle continues. Let's get one thing straight. There are no tigers in Egypt. Not now, not then. But someone, somewhere, saw a small, wrinkly tuber and decided to name it a tiger nut anyway. Marketing was rough in the Bronze Age. So there you are, wandering through the baking district of Thebes, and someone hands you what looks like a cookie, smells like sugar, and has the density of a papyrus scroll dipped in molasses. You take a bite. Crunchy, chewy, sweet, and weirdly floral. Congratulations, you've just encountered ancient Egypt's most beloved non-feline pastry. Tiger nuts, or chufa, weren't actually nuts, more like starchy root vegetables masquerading as dessert ingredients. But the Egyptians didn't care. They ground them into flour, mashed them into paste, or mixed them with honey and dates to form compact, round treats that stuck in your molars for days. A dentist's nightmare, a child's dream. The elite ate them as delicacies, often paired with wine or syrup, and served at banquets where someone played the lyre and someone else definitely vomited in the corner from too much date wine. You, a humble middle-class scribe with a chronic backache, probably got the economy version. Slightly burnt, less honey, more nut-like. One recipe even included pounding tiger nuts with honey, baking the paste in a fire-heated mould, and then finishing with a drizzle of date syrup. You'd think ancient Egypt invented the protein bar, only theirs was mostly sugar and passive aggression. Even tomb paintings feature these little delights. Imagine living in such reverence for a snack that you'd have it painted on your eternal resting place. Here lies Menkaure. He loved tiger nut balls and couldn't be stopped. Of course, after 2 or 3, your stomach starts whispering dissent. These pastries are deceptively heavy. You thought you could eat 6? That's cute. Now your jaw is sore, your belly full, and you're questioning the life choices that led you here. Again. Still, you'll go back tomorrow. You always do. Because despite the name, despite the texture, despite the regrets, these little sticky relics taste like ancient joy, and no tigers were harmed in the making. Just your digestive system. You've had tiger nut pastries. You've OD'd on dates. At this point, your stomach is more museum exhibit than organ. And yet, the snack stalls call to you once more. This time, something floral. The vendor hands you what looks like a soggy piece of parchment, crisped at the edges and smelling faintly of pond. You squint. Is it a chip? A petal? Something fished from a divine puddle? Nope. It's a lotus root snack, or something pretending to be one. Welcome to the world of quasi-lotus chips, where ingredients are sacred, methods are experimental, and texture is not guaranteed. Now, to be fair, the lotus flower was a very big deal in ancient Egypt. It symbolized rebirth, sunrises, and probably half the tattoos in Thebes. Every god worth their linen had one in hand or hair. So naturally, the edible parts, mainly the root and seeds, ended up in people's mouths. You nibble the edge. It's crunchy, kind of. Earthy, definitely. Slightly bitter, mildly sweet, vaguely like someone baked a philosophy scroll. These chips were likely thin-sliced lotus root, possibly sun-dried, maybe even toasted over embers, if you were lucky enough to know someone with fire access. Think of them as the ancient world's version of kale chips, only harder to Instagram. And while they might not be deep-fried in oil, oil being more precious than your entire goat-based fortune, the clever street chefs of Memphis may have basted them in date syrup or tossed them in spices, if available. Flavour ranged from mildly interesting to accidental incense. You pretend to enjoy it, mostly because the vendor is watching and the ibis behind you looks judgmental. But secretly, you're thinking, this could use a dip. Alas, dips haven't been invented yet, unless you count fermented fish paste, which is an acquired trauma. Still, it's hard to hate a snack that once fed gods and peasants alike. Plus, it's light, portable, and unlike those tiger nut bricks, it won't anchor itself in your colon for the next 3 days. You finish the lotus chip. You even consider another. But the sun is setting, and something smells like roasted onion nearby. Snack destiny awaits. The sun is scorching. The temples are booming with chants, and the air smells like a divine mixture of sweat, incense, and grilled mystery meat. Welcome to Festival Day in ancient Egypt, where religion meets chaos, and calories don't count because Ma'at is watching. You're not entirely sure what god is being celebrated today. It might be Bastet, goddess of cats and parties. Or maybe Hathor, goddess of music, booze, and doing things you won't remember. Either way, there's food. And in Egypt, that's all the theology you need. You elbow your way through a crowd of overly oiled dancers and duck past a priest banging cymbals near your eardrum. Then, like a mirage sent by the gods of glucose, You spot it. The festival food stall. There are honey cakes shaped like ankhs, date fritters sizzling on flat stones, roasted goose legs if your status permits. If not, loaves of bread with raisins and enough grit to polish your molars. Children run by with pomegranate-stained hands, possibly possessed by sugar. And you? You grab the ancient equivalent of a fried turnover. It's oozing fig paste, wrapped in barley dough and fried in sesame oil. Precious, rare, and clearly stolen from a nobleman's pantry. You bite into it. You see the sun. You hear the Nile. You temporarily forget you haven't bathed in a week. Festival food in Egypt was a rare explosion of excess in an otherwise grain-based, spiritually anxious diet. These were the days when the rules relaxed, at least slightly. And even the pharaoh might pretend not to notice that his lowest labourers were sneaking wine behind the grain bins. But moderation was not a known concept. You soon find yourself double-fisting honeyed beer buns, shouting praise to Ra with a mouthful of chickpea patties. The music swells. Someone is dancing with a crocodile effigy. You don't ask questions. You eat more. By the end of the night, you're lying in the sand with half a garland around your neck, a belly full of sacred grease, and the profound spiritual realization that you should have stopped at fritter number 3. But it's okay. The gods forgive many things. Festival food frenzy is one of them. You've eaten date bombs. You've gnawed on tiger nut bricks. You've survived a honeyed festival-induced sugar coma. And just when you thought your ancient Egyptian diet couldn't get any more textural, here comes the pièce de résistance, dried fish jerky. With a little sand for good measure. You're walking past a reed stall near the riverbank. It smells like something halfway between a cat's dream and a pharaoh's curse. You pause. A vendor grins at you, holding what looks like a sandal that's been left out too long in the sun. But no, it's a dried fish. You're not entirely sure what species it is. Nile perch? Mullet? Possibly something that died of natural causes. Doesn't matter. Once dried in the sun and slapped with a few mysterious herbs, it becomes the snack of champions, or at least of people who have low standards and strong jaws. You bite in. The texture is somewhere between driftwood and regret. The taste? Salty, fishy, with the surprise crunch of a tiny pebble tucked deep inside the flesh, like a mineral-filled Kinder Egg. This, dear friend, is ancient jerky, Egypt style. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't ceremonial. It was practical. When your civilization revolves around a massive, occasionally vengeful river, drying fish becomes second nature. No refrigeration, no problem. Just gut it, salt it, and leave it in the sun until it's no longer legally considered moist. And if you're thinking, that doesn't sound like junk food, remember, it was snackable, portable, addictive in a masochistic way. You couldn't eat just one, because the first one usually escaped mid-bite. Some varieties were spiced with herbs, others were marinated in brine before the slow desiccation process began. Either way, it ended up as the ancient equivalent of beef jerky, tough, salty, and favoured by travellers who hated themselves just enough. You carry your chewy, sand-encrusted treasure in a linen pouch. It smells. Oh, it smells, but it keeps the flies away, and also your friends. Bonus, by the time you're done gnawing through it, you've lost a molar and gained a profound appreciation for modern refrigeration. But hey, protein's protein. You've chewed fish jerky with sand. You've braved fig goo, festival fritters, and date-induced spiritual hallucinations. But now, as twilight softens the Nile's glimmer and your stomach audibly considers revolt, you stumble upon something that feels oddly sophisticated. A man with a clay jug and a crooked smile offers you a soaked scrap of bread. You raise an eyebrow. He gestures with great pride and zero explanation. You sniff. Ah, yes, barley beer, or what passes for it. This, dear friend, is flatbread dipped in booze, a culinary tradition for people who like their snacks mildly fermented and their coordination slightly compromised. Ancient Egyptian beer wasn't just a drink. It was practically a food group. Thick, porridge-like, and brewed with partially baked bread, It often resembled something between soup and science experiment. But occasionally, someone had the brilliant idea to dip actual bread into it, just to round out the experience of drinking your carbs and chewing them too. You give it a try. The flatbread, already coarse and grainy, now takes on a soggy sponginess. The beer adds an earthy tang, a fermented funk that says, aged in clay and blessed by Ra's armpit. Still, it's not bad. In fact, your third bite in, it becomes suspiciously comforting. This was the go-to snack of workers, scribes, and anyone needing a cheap thrill after a long day hauling stones or deciphering hieroglyphs that may or may not say, "Don't drink this." Sometimes the bread was stale. Sometimes the beer was practically vinegar. Occasionally both were blessed by flies. But when the stars aligned and the brew was freshish, the pairing was a satisfying, if mildly intoxicating, snack. Think of it as the ancient world's soggy beer pretzel, minus the salt, and hygiene. You sit back, munching your fermented flatbread, watching the moon rise over the reeds. You feel lightheaded. Could be the booze. Could be the realization that you've consumed roughly 60% of Egypt's carbohydrate output in one afternoon. Either way, you're content. Maybe even tipsy. You've had fish with crunch. You've dipped your bread in beer. You've bitten into enough dates to question your relationship with fiber. And now, finally, your sweet tooth thinks it's spotted salvation. A vendor beckoning with something that vaguely resembles a cookie. Sort of. If you squint. Behold, nutcakes, except minor detail. They're not always made with actual nuts. Oh sure, the name sounds promising. You imagine almonds, maybe pistachios, possibly a surprise hazelnut. But reality slaps you with a barley patty held together by fig paste, honey, and optimism, then dusted with whatever nuts were locally available. Sometimes tiger nuts, sometimes crushed seeds, sometimes things that were just crunchy and lying around. You take a bite. It's sweet, it's chewy, it's oddly sandy again. You don't question it anymore. Nutcakes were the closest ancient Egyptians got to pastries. They were portable, calorie-dense, and beloved by gods and workers alike. One of the few snack items that showed up in tomb offerings and in lunch sacks on construction sites. If that doesn't say versatile, what does? If you were rich, your version came sprinkled with actual tree-grown nuts and maybe imported cinnamon. If you were poor, you were lucky if yours didn't involve crushed pebbles and wasps. Still, the essence remained. Sticky sweetness bound with barley flour, meant to sustain body and spirit through temple ceremonies, pyramid building, and existential crises triggered by sudden sandstorms. You finish one, reach for another, and this time notice it's shaped like a little goddess. Cute, possibly edible, possibly sacred. You eat it anyway. By now your molars have developed calluses. You're not even chewing so much as compacting things with your jaw like a human grain press. But the sugar rush, oh, it's real. You feel Ra himself nodding in approval from somewhere above the palm trees. You sit back, nut cake in hand, belly slightly distended, and wonder how a civilization obsessed with balance and order managed to bake treats that could double as emergency bricks. And yet, you'd eat 3 more. Because like most junk food, it's not about logic. It's about the joy of eating dessert that vaguely pretends to be nutritious while actively sabotaging your dental future. You're feeling adventurous, or perhaps delirious from your previous encounter with beer bread and nut pebbles. Either way, you're in the mood for something sweet, something smooth, something that doesn't require dental insurance. You see a glistening amber goo drizzled onto a platter of figs. It looks like syrup. It smells like syrup. You're convinced this is the ancient Egyptian answer to maple. You reach out, fingers first, obviously, and make contact with what can only be described as molasses with a vendetta. It clings. To your skin. To your hopes. To your very soul. You try to shake it off. It retaliates. Now it's on both hands, and somehow your elbows, and there's sand stuck in it. Of course there is. Congratulations. You've just discovered date syrup, one of ancient Egypt's stickiest culinary creations. Made by boiling dates down into a thick tar-like goo, it was poured over bread, fruits, pastries, and, on particularly lawless afternoons, directly into the mouth, though calling it poured is generous. This stuff oozes slower than a Nile tax collector in July. You finally manage to get a glob onto your barley loaf. It shimmers menacingly. You bite in. The sweetness explodes. Rich, complex, almost spicy, like someone condensed an orchard into a single bite and then dared you to chew through it. In ancient times, this syrup wasn't just food. It was medicine. Or at least, that's what healers claimed after watching people cry trying to swallow it off a spoon. It was also used as a preservative, a glaze, and very possibly an industrial adhesive. And no, there was no such thing as portion control. If it didn't drip, it wasn't enough. You look down, you've managed to syrup your tunic, your forearm, and the lower half of a passing cat. The vendor hands you a cloth that feels more ceremonial than sanitary. Too late. You are the syrup now. But as you lick your fingers like a well-fed priest of Hathor, you realize something. You're not just eating dessert. You're partaking in sweet warfare. Sticky, unyielding, delicious, and you'll be scrubbing it off for the next lunar cycle. You've eaten syrup that clings like guilt. You've gnawed on beer-soaked bread. At this point, your stomach is less a digestive organ and more of an archaeological test site. But there's one more snack staring at you with the confidence of something that's been around for millennia and has absolutely no business being chewable. Behold, fig bricks. You approach the vendor. He grins and slices off a slab of what looks like construction material that got into a bar fight with a fruit basket. You pick it up. It has weight, density, ambition. You take a bite and immediately realize that this snack could be used to fortify a tomb. These weren't just called fig bricks for fun. Ancient Egyptians literally compressed mashed figs, sometimes with barley or date paste, into thick rectangular shapes. Think granola bar meets paving stone. If that sounds appealing, congratulations. Your standards have eroded. The flavour? Surprisingly rich. Figs offer that deep, caramelized sweetness, paired with tiny seeds that explode like edible static in your mouth. But the texture? Imagine chewing through ambition. It's sticky, gritty, and insists on lingering in your molars like a vengeful spirit. Fig bricks were the ancient equivalent of energy bars. Packed with natural sugars and fibres, they kept labourers, soldiers, and hieroglyphic doodlers going through long shifts and dramatic temple drama. They were portable, durable, and nearly immortal. Archaeologists have found some still intact, possibly still chewable. Some even had herbs mixed in, not for flavour, but for digestion. Because once this thing hits your colon, it's every god for himself. You try to finish your piece. Halfway through, you consider saving the rest as a doorstop, or a self-defense weapon. But somehow, some way, it grows on you. Not in a mouldy way, more in a my jaw has given up and accepted its fate kind of way. And then, like a true Egyptian peasant, you wipe your hands on your tunic and sigh. You're full. Not in a that was delicious way, more in a I just ate a brick of slow-moving fibre kind of way. But hey, you survived it. You wake up groggy, fig brick still lodged somewhere between your soul and small intestine, and wonder, what did the gods snack on? Well, good news. You're surrounded by temples, priests, and offerings that make your midnight binge look like amateur hour. Because in ancient Egypt, snacking wasn't just personal, it was divine. You stroll into a temple courtyard. There, laid out on polished alabaster altars, are rows of treats, neatly arranged, annoyingly symmetrical, and offered to gods who probably didn't even have digestive tracts. There's beer, of course. There's always beer. Next to it, loaves of bread shaped like cobras, birds, and what might be a really passive-aggressive cat. Then there are fruits, dates, figs, and grapes, stacked like they're trying to win a pyramid stacking contest. And at the centre, sacred pastries, shaped like eyes, ankhs, and other symbols you suspect might translate loosely to, "Please don't smite me." You reach out. A priest slaps your hand. Apparently, divine snacks are not for common mortals with honey on their tunics. These food offerings weren't symbolic, they were serious business. Egyptians believed their gods needed sustenance, just like people. The difference? Humans only starved during famines. Gods starved when temple interns forgot the snack schedule. Each morning, fresh food was placed before statues, and each evening it was removed. Did the gods actually eat it? Not exactly. But the smell, the essence, that was for them. The leftovers, for the priests. Divine trickle-down economics at its finest. And guess what? Some of these offerings weren't just old bread and stale beer. There were sweet buns filled with dates, honey-glazed barley cakes, and the infamous tiger nut pastries, lovingly shaped to please the deities and possibly break the molars of their servants. You spot one final item, a pyramid-shaped sweet made of ground seeds and honey. Probably symbolic. Possibly rock hard. Almost definitely going to end up in someone's lunch basket tomorrow. As you leave the temple, stomach still recovering from your own private snack pilgrimage, you marvel at a society that didn't just eat to survive, but ate to connect with the divine. And frankly, any god who demands honey cakes on the daily, that's your kind of deity. You've eaten your way through Egypt's street stalls, temple offerings, and fig-based dental traps, but now you stumble upon the most exclusive feast of all, and the guest of honor. Extremely deceased. You're standing in a tomb. It's silent, musty, and full of gold. But nestled among the treasures, linen, and sacred texts, there it is. A snack basket. Yes, really. The ancient Egyptians didn't just believe in an afterlife, they believed in an afterlife with room service. Tombs were stocked with food for the dead to enjoy for eternity. And by enjoy, we mean eternally nibble in spirit form, while the physical food turned into a fossilized buffet for archaeologists 3,000 years later. And what was on the menu? The usual junk. Dried figs, date cakes, barley loaves, honeyed pastries, and, if the deceased had money to burn, entire roasted ducks and salted fish. Basically, the ancient version of a deluxe snack hamper, minus the cheese wheel and wine opener. But the truly iconic feature? Shabtis, little servant figurines whose job was to tend the fields and fetch snacks for the dead. You didn't have to work in the afterlife. You had help. You brought your own snack interns. And if you were royalty? Oh, buddy. Pharaohs took it to the next level. King Tut's tomb included over 40 jars of wine and actual loaves of still recognizable bread. It's one thing to be mummified. It's another to have your bread survive just as long. Preservatives? Who needs them when your pantry is sealed tighter than a government conspiracy? You look at the offerings and realize something humbling. These people were planning eternal snacking. You struggle to plan lunch tomorrow. The dead had menus. Sure, some of the food turned to dust and the wine probably oxidized into something resembling embalming fluid. But it wasn't about freshness. It was about preparedness. The dead didn't fear hunger. They feared not having snacks when Osiris came knocking. So here you are. You've devoured honey bombs, sipped chewable beer, survived fig bricks, and even considered stealing food from the gods. But now comes the ultimate realization. In ancient Egypt, the snacking never stopped, not even after death. And that's not a metaphor. You look around and realize these people weren't just obsessed with food, they were planning lifetime-long snack strategies, and then after-lifetime strategies. Your modern pantry has half a bag of chips and some pickles. Their tombs had menu rotation. The ancient Egyptians believed hunger didn't end with your pulse. The afterlife was long, uncertain, and possibly full of awkward judgment scenarios. So naturally you'd want to face eternity with your stomach at least half full. Enter the eternal munchies. We're talking celestial snack planning. Magical spells in the Book of the Dead literally included requests for 1,000 loaves, 1,000 jars of beer, 1,000 oxen, and 1,000 fowl. That's not dinner. That's an afterlife Costco run. And if the magic didn't work? Not to worry, food models were added too. Little wooden carvings of bakeries, breweries, and butchers were tucked into tombs like primitive food trucks for the underworld. If you were rich, you got tiny snack stuff. If you were poor, you got prayers and maybe a barley biscuit. Good luck with that. You, modern reader, suddenly feel underprepared. You don't even know what you're having for lunch tomorrow. These people had their eternal lunch break pre-booked. And what did this eternal menu include? The same indulgent stuff you've already tried. Beer, bread, cakes, dates, honey, salted meats, nuts, and figs. The only difference is, it was supposed to last until your soul was judged, your heart weighed, and, if all went well, you ascended to the field of reeds where, surprise, even more snacks awaited. You stare into the tomb's shadowy distance and imagine it. Endless barley beer fountains, honey flowing like the Nile, and an afterlife where the only consequence of overeating is celestial satisfaction. And that is how you conclude your journey. Not with indigestion, but with awe. Because no one did eternal snacking quite like the Egyptians. Imagine Mongolia in July, a sea of rolling green steppe under a vast blue sky, dotted with white felt gers like pearls on the horizon. The land itself seems to come alive, and so do its people. This is Naadam, the grand midsummer celebration that every Mongolian knows not just as a festival, but as a declaration of identity. While outsiders may see it as colourful performances and exciting contests, for Mongols, Naadam is far deeper. It is history, culture, spirituality, and survival, all tied together in a single fiery heartbeat. At its core, Naadam means gathering. Families travel from isolated grasslands, sometimes days on horseback or by truck, to converge on villages, towns, and the capital, Ulaanbaatar. The atmosphere is electric. Vendors selling fried kushur dumplings line the streets, musicians tune their morin kur fiddles, and elders share oral tales of Genghis Khan's warriors as children run through crowds in excitement. The festival begins officially with a parade. Soldiers, monks, musicians, and athletes marching before a roaring audience. Brightly coloured costumes, flowing silk deals and banners flutter against the wind, while the national flag rises with solemn dignity. But Naadam is more than pomp. It is the rare moment in the year when Mongols gather as a nation, not scattered herding families, but a single people bound by tradition. It recalls centuries of resilience, from medieval Khans to Soviet hardships, reminding everyone that though the world changes, the essence of Mongol culture remains unbroken. When the wrestling matches start, when arrows whistle through the air, when horses thunder across the plains, each act connects the present to a long, unbroken chain of ancestors who lived, fought, and thrived on these lands. And of course, there is food. If sports embody strength, the feast embodies community. Tables overflow with boiled mutton, fermented mare's milk, creamy dairy curds, and endless trays of roasted meats, dishes designed to honour both guests and ancestors. Eating together is as important as the games themselves, for no Naadam is complete without a shared meal. The air is filled with laughter, music, and the smoky aroma of grilled lamb, mingling with the dust kicked up by horses. Naadam is not just Mongolia's festival, it is Mongolia itself, condensed into 3 days of spirit, tradition, and feasting on the steppe. At the heart of Naadam are the legendary 3 manly sports: wrestling, archery, and horse racing. For centuries, these contests have defined what it meant to be strong, skillful, and enduring in the unforgiving Mongolian steppe. They are not just games staged for entertainment, but living traditions that trace back to the warriors of Genghis Khan, who relied on these exact skills to build one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. Wrestling, or buk, is perhaps the most iconic. There are no weight classes, no rounds, no protective mats. 2 competitors step onto the dusty field wearing only short, open-chested jackets, tight briefs, and heavy boots. Their outfits symbolize freedom and honesty, the open chest design famously added to prevent women from secretly competing, though today that rule feels outdated. The goal is simple: force your opponent to touch the ground with any part of their body other than their feet or hands. But Burk is not just physical, it is spiritual. Before every bout, wrestlers raise their arms and mimic the flight of the mythical eagle, honouring the spirits of the steppe. Victors are celebrated not only as athletes, but as cultural heroes, their titles echoing through local memory for decades. Archery brings a different energy. Men and women alike stand in long lines, dressed in colourful deals, and draw traditional composite bows, powerful weapons once feared by armies across Eurasia. The targets are not bullseyes on paper, but small leather rings placed on the ground, requiring deadly precision. Arrows whistle through the air as teams chant rhythmic encouragements. It feels less like a modern sport, and more like stepping into a medieval battlefield where accuracy meant survival. And then there is horse racing, a spectacle unlike anything in the world. Mongolian horses are small but powerful, perfectly adapted to the steppe. The jockeys, children, some as young as 5 or 6, because their lightweight allows the horses to run faster. These races stretch for miles across open fields, the thundering hooves raising clouds of dust visible for kilometres. Families wait anxiously, cheering for their young riders. Winning a Naadam horse race is one of the greatest honours a family can achieve, and the horse itself is praised with songs and garlands. Together, these 3 sports are more than competition. They are Mongolia's heartbeat, keeping ancient skills alive and passing them to new generations. While the contests of Naadam stir the dust of the steppe, the feasts fill the air with their own kind of energy. Food is as central to Naadam as wrestling, archery, or horse racing. It is the glue that binds the gathering together, because Mongolian culture has always understood something simple yet profound. A celebration is nothing without a shared table. The centerpiece of this table is meat, especially mutton. Sheep are the lifeblood of the steppe, and during Naadam, countless animals are prepared for guests and families alike. The most iconic dish is budog, an entire goat or marmot cooked from the inside out, with hot stones placed directly into the cavity of the animal, searing the meat and releasing rich, smoky flavours. Guests gather around, pulling apart tender pieces with their hands, passing them around as a symbol of generosity and unity. Then there is korkog, another classic, where chunks of lamb are slow-cooked with vegetables and hot stones in a sealed metal pot, creating a stew so savoury that its aroma alone can draw a crowd. But the feast doesn't end with meat. Dairy is equally important, reflecting Mongolia's nomadic reliance on livestock. Plates of arul, dried curds that range from sweet to sour, are passed around like snacks. Bowls of thick clotted cream, known as urum, are served with bread, while pitchers of fermented mare's milk, or airag, are poured generously for adults. Drinking airag is almost a ritual in itself. Sour, slightly fizzy, and made in large leather bags, it is believed to carry both nutritional and spiritual power, connecting those who drink it to the land and its herds. Street vendors thrive during Naadam as well, selling fried kushur, crispy meat-filled dumplings that are greasy, satisfying, and perfect for grabbing between events. Lines of people form around kushur stalls, the scent of sizzling dough becoming one of the unofficial aromas of the festival. For many Mongols, eating kushur at Naadam is as essential as watching the horse races. When people sit to eat, it is never only about filling the stomach. The feast is a social ritual, a chance to greet old friends, honour guests, and strengthen bonds between families and clans. In every shared bowl of meat, in every sip of airag, lies the spirit of Naadam, community, tradition, and abundance. No feast is complete without drink, and in Mongolia, Naadam wouldn't feel whole without the unique beverages that have flavoured nomadic life for centuries. But here's the twist. Traditional Mongolian drinks are not your standard lagers or sweet wines. Some of them you don't just sip, you almost chew. The most famous among them is airag, fermented mare's milk, a drink so tied to Naadam that its absence would feel like a missing limb of the festival. Ayrag is unlike anything found in the West. It is made by milking mares during the summer, pouring the fresh milk into large leather bags, and then stirring, sometimes hundreds or even thousands of times, with a wooden paddle until it ferments. The result is fizzy, slightly sour, low in alcohol but strong in symbolism. To drink it is to taste Mongolia itself, the land, the animals, the cycle of nomadic life. At Naadam, hosts pour it freely for guests, and to refuse would be considered rude. Sharing a bowl of Ayrag is as much about respect as refreshment, but Ayrag isn't the only drink on the Naadam table. There are other dairy-based concoctions that verge on being food themselves. Tarag, a thick yogurt drink, and Biaslag, a fermented cheese liquid, are heavy, rich, and filling. Then there is Shimin Arki, often called milk vodka, distilled from fermented milk. It can be surprisingly strong. These drinks blur the line between nourishment and intoxication, and many are so hearty that chewing them feels more accurate than drinking. The act of drinking during Naadam carries ritual weight. Bowls, not glasses, are passed hand to hand. Elders are always served first, a sign of respect. When someone hands you a bowl of Ayrag, you must take it with your right hand and support your elbow with the left, an old gesture of honour. To drink together is to cement friendship, to reaffirm kinship, and to acknowledge the ancient hospitality of the steppe. Foreign visitors often approach these drinks with hesitation. The sharp tang of Ayrag, the thickness of dairy brews, the warmth of milk vodka. They can all be shocking to a modern palate. Yet, in the laughter of friends, the clinking of bowls, and the roar of the festival, these drinks weave people together. In that moment, Naadam becomes more than spectacle. It becomes communion. Amid the smoky mutton, sizzling dumplings, and endless bowls of fermented milk, Naadam also offers something many visitors don't expect: sweets. Mongolia may be a land famous for its rugged meat and dairy, but when the Naadam festival rolls in, the tables also welcome treats that balance the heaviness of meat with bursts of sugar and richness. Chief among them are honey-based confections, sometimes called balin bortsog, the honey bombs of the steppe. Bortsog are small, golden, deep-fried dough pieces, a bit like donuts, but denser and more rustic. During Naadam, they are often drenched in honey, piled into bowls, and passed around with tea. The combination of fried bread and sticky sweetness makes them dangerously addictive. They are simple to make: flour, butter, milk, and eggs fried in oil, but during the festival, they become symbolic. In nomadic life, sugar and honey were luxuries, and to serve them during Naadam meant abundance, generosity, and celebration. The honey bombs aren't alone, though. Families also prepare Yule Bouv, large layered ceremonial cakes topped with sugar cubes and sweets. While these cakes are most prominent during Lunar New Year, they sometimes appear at Naadam feasts as well, standing tall like edible monuments. Children circle the tables, snatching at pieces of fried dough or licking their fingers clean from honey drips, while parents laugh and pretend not to notice. Honey itself has long held symbolic value in Mongolia. Nomads saw it as a gift of health and vitality, and it was believed to strengthen the body for long journeys or hard labour. At Naadam, honey-glazed bortsog embody this idea of strength meeting sweetness. After hours of cheering at wrestling matches or chasing horses across the plains, a handful of honey bombs restores energy and keeps spirits high. And sweets are never consumed alone. They're paired with steaming cups of sute tsai, salty milk tea, creating an unexpectedly delightful contrast. The salt cuts through the sugar, balancing flavours in a way only the nomadic palate could invent. For guests from afar, it may seem strange at first, but once you sit in a gyr sharing tea and honey bombs, the combination feels natural, even necessary. In the end, Naadam's honey bombs remind us that feasting is not just about survival foods, meat, milk, and bread, but about indulgence too. They add sparkle to the table, laughter to the meal, and sweetness to the memory of Mongolia's greatest celebration. Though Mongolia is a land of steppe, wind, and livestock, Naadam tables sometimes surprise visitors with delicacies brought in from faraway lands. Among these, dried fruits, especially dates, stand out. They aren't grown in the cold Mongolian climate, but through centuries of trade along the Silk Road, dates became a treasured guest at feasts. During Naadam, bowls of them sit beside heaps of meat and trays of fried bread, offering bursts of concentrated sweetness that contrast the heaviness of lamb and dairy. For nomads, dates were more than candy. They were survival food. Packed with energy, easy to store and resistant to spoiling, they became a practical luxury for long rides across the steppe. By the time Naadam rolled around, offering dates was a mark of prosperity and hospitality. A way to show guests that you had access to the riches of distant deserts and markets. It was a little taste of Samarkand or Bukhara, carried all the way into the heart of Mongolia. During the festival, children reach eagerly for the sticky, chewy fruits, savouring them as treats between wrestling matches or horse races. Elders, too, chew slowly, reminiscing about old days when dried fruits were rare treasures, sometimes arriving only once a year. To serve dates in abundance during Naadam is to declare, "We are blessed this year, and we share that blessing with you." But dates do more than stand alone. They often mingle with other festival snacks. Chopped and mixed into bowls with arul, dried curds, they create a sweet-sour combo that keeps mouths busy during long afternoons of celebration. Some hosts even stuff dates with nuts or drizzle them with honey, turning them into bite-sized luxuries on a table otherwise dominated by savoury foods. Guests nibble them slowly, almost ceremoniously, aware that what they eat links Mongolia to centuries of traders, travellers, and empires that once passed through the Silk Road. For modern Mongols, dates remain an important festival treat, though easier to obtain today than in the past. At Naadam, their role is not merely culinary, but symbolic. They remind people that Mongolia, though remote and self-reliant, has always been connected to the wider world. In every sticky bite of a date lies a taste of history, a reminder that even in the most rugged steppes, sweetness finds its way home. Among the array of Naadam treats, there are certain snacks that make foreigners pause, partly because of their names. Take tiger nut pastries. Despite the dramatic sound, there are no tigers involved, and in fact, tiger nuts aren't even nuts. They're tiny, chewy tubers, sometimes called earth almonds, that have been enjoyed since ancient times across Asia and beyond. In Mongolia, they found their way into the festival spread through centuries of trade and adaptation, becoming part of Naadam's sweet traditions. Tiger nuts are naturally sweet and nutty, with a texture that's both chewy and crunchy. Mongols discovered that when ground and mixed with flour, butter, and a touch of honey, they could be turned into dense pastries, something portable, filling, and perfect for long journeys. By the time Naadam comes around, these pastries become more than survival food. They are festive indulgences, served alongside fried dough, dates, and dairy treats. In the days leading up to the festival, families prepare them at home, frying or baking little rounds of tiger nut dough until they turn golden brown. Once cooled, they're stacked high on plates in the GER, ready to be offered to guests. Children are especially fond of them, nibbling through the crunchy outside to get to the slightly chewy centre. Some families add honey glazes or sprinkle sugar on top, turning the rustic tuber into something almost decadent. The appeal of tiger nut pastries isn't just their flavour, but their history. They symbolise Mongolia's openness to foods beyond the steppe. Just as dates came by caravan from the deserts to the west, tiger nuts remind people of Mongolia's role as a crossroads of cultures. At Naadam, serving such treats signals not only generosity, but also awareness of the wider world that has always brushed against the Mongolian frontier. When paired with salty milk tea or bowls of ayrag, tiger nut pastries become part of the rhythm of feasting. Guests lean back, full from roasted lamb, and reach for something lighter, sweeter, to cleanse the palate. The pastries may not be as famous as kusho dumplings or as iconic as a bowl of ayrag, but they add an important note to the festival symphony. Sweetness with roots far older and broader than Mongolia itself. In short, tiger nut pastries prove that Naadam isn't only about the local and the traditional, it's about how Mongols have woven the world's flavours into their own identity. At first glance, Mongolia doesn't strike visitors as a land where lotus flowers grow. The steppe is too cold, too dry, too harsh for such delicate plants. Yet at Naadam, you might find something locals jokingly call lotus chips. They aren't made from actual lotus blossoms, but from the root, a trade good that travelled centuries ago along the Silk Road and eventually slipped into Mongolian kitchens. Over time, these crisp, wheel-shaped slices became a novelty snack, bridging the gap between the foreign and the familiar. Lotus root has a distinctive look. When sliced, it forms a natural pattern of holes, resembling little wagon wheels. Mongols, ever resourceful, discovered that when thinly cut and fried, the root transforms into something crunchy, savoury, and strangely addictive. At Naadam feasts, lotus chips add variety to the otherwise heavy spread of meats and dairy. They are sprinkled with a touch of salt, sometimes honey, and served in bowls right next to hushor dumplings. For many families, their presence is less about tradition and more about delight, a small surprise on the festival table. Their arrival in Mongolia tells a bigger story. The Mongols of the Empire days weren't just warriors, they were traders, conquerors, and cultural borrowers. Goods from China, Persia, and India flowed into the Mongol world, and foods like lotus root left their mark. Even today, the chip-like snack stands as a quiet reminder that Mongolia has never been an isolated land, but part of a vast web of exchange. Eating lotus chips at Naadam is both a sensory break and a social cue. After gorging on heavy lamb dishes, guests reach for something lighter, crispier. The crunch cuts through the richness of the feast, keeping palates entertained. Children love the playful shape, holding up the little rings like toys before popping them into their mouths. Elders often smile at the sight, recalling stories of how such foods were once rare luxuries, available only in larger towns with strong trade connections. So while lotus chips may not be as deeply traditional as airag or korkog, their presence shows how Naadam is not frozen in time. The festival table evolves, adapting new flavours while still holding to its roots. In every crackling bite of lotus chip lies both Mongolia's openness to the outside world and its genius for making foreign things its own. If wrestling matches, thundering horse races and soaring arrows give Naadam its rhythm, then the feast gives it its soul. But what makes the food scene at Naadam so unforgettable isn't only the dishes themselves, it's the frenzy. Picture entire families spilling out of gers, vendors shouting over one another, and crowds moving like tides between competitions and food stalls. The festival is as much about eating as it is about celebrating, and during Naadam, no one leaves hungry. The first thing that strikes you is the smell. Clouds of smoke from grilling lamb mingle with the oil-rich aroma of frying kushur. Street vendors are everywhere, their hands working non-stop, flipping dumplings, pouring steaming bowls of salty milk tea, and handing out skewers of sizzling meat. Lines form in minutes, then dissolve into eager, hungry throngs as trays of food disappear into waiting hands. At any moment, it feels as if the entire steppe has turned into one enormous kitchen. Inside family gatherings, the frenzy is quieter, but no less intense. Gers overflow with food, whole sheep boiled and carved with ritual precision, dairy platters stacked high, bowls of airag constantly being refilled. Guests arrive, are seated, and immediately offered food, whether they are ready to eat or not. Hospitality is relentless. To decline a dish too firmly is almost an insult. In a culture where survival once depended on generosity, offering abundance at Naadam is a sacred duty. Children dart between the feast and the games, clutching fried dough in one hand and tugging at a parent's sleeve with the other. Teenagers cluster around vendors selling sweet drinks or candies, while elders sit cross-legged in the shade, sipping airag and observing the chaos with amused patience. The food frenzy is not disorder but a celebration of life itself, noisy, messy, generous, and full of laughter. What's remarkable is that no matter how crowded or frenzied, Naadam's feasts never lose their sense of ritual. Every bite connects to ancestry, Every shared bowl affirms friendship, and every loud, joyful moment reflects the resilience of a people who thrive on the harsh steppe by celebrating together. By the time the sun sets and the music fades, the dust may settle, but the taste of Naadam lingers in the belly, in the memory, and in the spirit of Mongolia. On the Mongolian steppe of the late 12th century, survival was not guaranteed. The winds cut sharp across the grasslands, winters froze entire herds, and betrayal often came swifter than the next sunrise. Into this world was born Temujin, the boy who would one day become Genghis Khan. His childhood, however, gave no hint of future greatness. When his father, a minor chieftain, was poisoned by rivals, Temujin was left vulnerable. The tribe that should have protected his family abandoned them, leaving his mother, brothers and sisters to fend for themselves in poverty. Temujin, barely a teenager, found himself hunting rodents and scraping marrow from bones just to survive. Hardship was his first teacher, but it was betrayal that taught him ambition. When former allies enslaved him, Temujin endured humiliation with quiet resolve. He eventually escaped, not merely free but hardened, his mind sharpened by the knowledge that trust and power must always be carefully managed. Each setback carved resilience into his character. While other boys of the steppe lived only to herd and fight, Temujin began to think bigger, to dream of uniting the fractured Mongol world. The steppe at the time was a cauldron of feuding clans and shifting alliances. Loyalty lasted only as long as the next raid, and blood feuds stretched across generations. Temujin realized that survival in such a world required more than brute strength. It demanded vision. He began gathering allies not through intimidation alone, but through trust, marriages, and personal bonds sealed in blood oaths. His charisma drew warriors who valued discipline over chaos, and he rewarded loyalty with opportunity, even if it meant elevating men of low birth over noble rivals. By his early adulthood, Temujin had clawed his way from exile to leadership. He defeated rival tribes with a mixture of ferocity and cunning, reshaping the political map of the steppe. In 1206, after years of campaigning and alliance building, the scattered tribes finally acknowledged his supremacy. A great assembly, or Kurultai, proclaimed him Genghis Khan, universal ruler. It was a moment that marked not only the rise of one man, but the transformation of a fragmented people into a single unified force. The boy who had once scavenged scraps on the frozen grasslands now stood at the head of a nation, and with unity achieved, his eyes turned outward. The world beyond the steppe would soon feel the thunder of Mongol hooves. When Temujin became Genghis Khan in 1206, he inherited not a peaceful kingdom, but a tinderbox of rival clans, each armed, suspicious, and steeped in centuries of grudges. The Mongols were fierce warriors, but their disunity made them vulnerable. Genghis understood that to conquer the world beyond the steppe, he first had to conquer the Mongols themselves, and to do that, he had to reshape how they thought about loyalty, honor, and power. His solution was both brutal and brilliant. He enforced the yasa, a code of law that demanded strict discipline and obedience. It was said that under this law, a man could leave a golden saddle in the open steppe, and no one would dare steal it. But the yasa was more than just rules. It was a revolutionary attempt to break the old aristocratic order. No longer would loyalty to a clan outweigh loyalty to the Khan. No longer would noble birth guarantee power. Instead, men rose through merit, courage, and loyalty. This policy attracted ambitious warriors from rival tribes who saw in Genghis a leader who rewarded ability rather than bloodline. Still, unity required blood. Genghis did not hesitate to annihilate entire clans that defied him, sending a clear message that betrayal would be met with extermination. At the same time, he practiced a calculated generosity. When he defeated enemies, he often incorporated their warriors into his ranks, offering them a new life if they swore loyalty. The result was an army that was both feared and admired, composed of men bound not by fragile tribal ties, but by shared allegiance to one ruler. Central to his rise were personal bonds known as anda, brotherhood oaths sealed with blood. Temujin himself had sworn such bonds in his youth, and as Khan, he used them to build a loyal circle of generals and companions. These men, Subutai, Jebe, and others, became the architects of his future conquests. Their loyalty was not blind devotion, but trust forged in hardship, sealed by Genghis's consistent willingness to reward those who served him well. By the time his reforms and campaigns subdued the last independent tribes, Genghis Khan had achieved something unprecedented. He had turned a quarrelsome collection of nomadic clans into a disciplined war machine. The Mongols were no longer fighting each other. United by blood and oath, they were ready to fight the world. Once the steppe tribes were united under his banner, Genghis Khan turned his gaze southward. Beyond the mountains and deserts lay the wealthy dynasties of northern China, the Tanguts of Xixia, and the Jurchen-led Jin Empire. Their lands promised silk, grain, and gold, luxuries unknown to the herders of Mongolia. To the Mongols, the walled cities of China were both a challenge and a temptation, and to Genghis, they were an opportunity to test his new empire's strength. The first target was Xixia, a kingdom whose fortified towns and irrigated fields contrasted starkly with the wide-open steppes. In 1209, Genghis launched his campaign. His cavalry swept across the land, devastating farms and cutting supply lines, forcing the Tanguts to retreat behind their stone walls. At first, the Mongols lacked the siegecraft to break them, but Genghis adapted quickly. He recruited Chinese engineers, learned the use of catapults and siege towers, and soon, the invincible horsemen of the steppe became just as deadly against fortresses as they were in open battle. Xixia surrendered, paying tribute and offering their princess in marriage. It was the first taste of conquest beyond Mongolia, and it whetted Genghis's appetite. The greater prize was the Jin dynasty. Rich, powerful, and arrogant, the Jin rulers underestimated the new Khan. They mocked him, refusing his demands for tribute. Genghis responded with the fury of the steppe. In 1211, he led his armies through the Great Wall itself, outmaneuvering Jin defences with lightning strikes. His cavalry encircled larger armies, showering them with arrows before closing in with curved sabres. The Jin capital at Zhongdu, modern Beijing, was besieged, and though it held out for years, the Mongols ravaged the countryside, starving the city into submission. What shocked the Chinese, and later the world, was Genghis's relentless adaptability. He absorbed the technologies of his enemies, turning their knowledge into his weapon. Siege engineers, scribes, artisans, even defected generals, all found themselves woven into the Mongol war machine. Genghis did not merely conquer. He learned, he borrowed, and he refined. By the time the Jin were forced into humiliating submission, the Mongols had proven themselves not just as raiders, but as a force capable of dismantling empires. The steppe horsemen, once dismissed as barbarians, were now an unstoppable tide pressing deeper into the heart of China. And this was only the beginning. Even as Genghis Khan's armies pressed deep into northern China, his eyes shifted westward. Beyond the Gobi and across Central Asia stretched the lands of the Kara-Khitai and the Khwarezmian Empire, crossroads of the Silk Road, rich with caravans carrying spices, textiles, and silver. These kingdoms stood between the Mongols and the wealth of Persia, the Middle East, and Europe. To conquer them would mean not just plunder, but control of the arteries of global trade. The first step was the defeat of the Kara-Khitai in 1218. Their ruler, the Gur Khan, commanded a decaying empire propped up by mercenaries and fractured loyalties. Genghis's generals Subutai and Jebe exploited these weaknesses with surgical strikes. Their cavalry cut through the empire's defences with terrifying precision, and many local rulers defected rather than face Mongol wrath. Within a year, the Kara-Khitai collapsed, clearing the way toward the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful states of the Islamic world. Initially, Genghis sought diplomacy. He sent a caravan of merchants and envoys to Khwarezmian Shah Ala ad-Din Muhammad, proposing trade. The Shah, suspicious and arrogant, responded with betrayal. The merchants were executed, and an ambassador was mutilated, an insult Genghis could not forgive. For the Mongols, diplomacy had its place, but dishonor demanded vengeance. In 1219, the Khan unleashed one of the most devastating campaigns in history. The Mongols stormed into Transoxiana, crossing rivers and deserts with speed no one thought possible. Cities like Bukhara and Samarkand, jewels of Islamic culture, fell in rapid succession. Chroniclers describe the Khan entering Bukhara's mosque and declaring, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Whether he spoke those exact words or not, the message was clear. Resistance was futile. The campaign was a masterclass in strategy. Subutai and Jebe led feigned retreats, luring enemies into ambushes. Entire armies dissolved in confusion, unable to match Mongol mobility. Cities that resisted were annihilated, their populations slaughtered or enslaved. Those that surrendered quickly were spared, folded into the Mongol system of tribute. By 1221, the Khwarezmian Empire was shattered, its Shah fleeing in disgrace. The westward campaigns transformed Genghis Khan from a regional conqueror into a global terror. His empire now spanned from the Yellow River to the Caspian Sea. For the first time, the Islamic world, Europe, and Christendom realized they faced an enemy unlike any before. One who blended diplomacy, terror, and innovation into unstoppable conquest. The fall of the Khwarezmian Empire left Central Asia in ruins, but for Genghis Khan, vengeance was not yet complete. The Shah who had insulted him, Ala ad-Din Muhammad, fled westward, abandoning his cities and subjects. Mongol forces pursued him across deserts and mountains with relentless determination. Though the Shah eventually died in exile on an island in the Caspian Sea in 1220, the pursuit itself symbolized Genghis's resolve. No insult to Mongol envoys, no breach of diplomatic custom would ever go unpunished. But the Khan's armies were not finished. They turned their fury on Persia. The invasion of Persia was both strategic and symbolic. Persia was a land of flourishing cities, Islamic scholarship, and thriving markets, but it was also a fragmented realm, vulnerable to Mongol discipline. In 1220-1221, Mongol generals Subutai and Jebe spearheaded the campaign, leading rapid advances that stunned defenders. The Mongols moved in columns across vast distances, coordinating attacks that seemed impossible given the terrain. No river, desert, or mountain could slow their cavalry. Cities that resisted paid the highest price. Nishapur, after a prolonged siege, was raised in vengeance when a Mongol commander, Genghis' own son-in-law, was killed. Chroniclers claim hundreds of thousands were slaughtered, though such numbers may be exaggerated. The brutality, however, was undeniable. Entire neighbourhoods were levelled, and survivors were carried off as slaves. For the Mongols, terror was not a byproduct of war. It was a weapon, designed to shatter resistance before it could form. Other cities, however, learned the lesson and opened their gates. Those that surrendered quickly were often spared mass destruction, their artisans and scholars spared to serve the empire. Genghis had no interest in ruling smoking ruins alone. Engineers, scribes, and craftsmen were absorbed into Mongol service, transported back to Karakoram or to serve in other campaigns. The Khan's genius lay in turning conquered populations into fuel for further conquests. By 1221, the Mongols had cut a swath through Persia, leaving behind a trail of broken cities and shattered armies. The Islamic world was shaken to its core. Rumours spread that the Mongols were a scourge sent by God, a divine punishment made flesh. For Genghis Khan, the campaign was more than vengeance. It was proof that his empire had no borders. The Mongols could strike anywhere, and no kingdom, however ancient or proud, was beyond their reach. Even as Genghis Khan tightened his grip on Persia, his ambitions and curiosity stretched further west. The Mongols had already crushed kingdoms across Asia, but now their riders advanced into the unfamiliar forests and riverlands of Eastern Europe. These expeditions, launched around 1221-1223, were led not by Genghis himself, but by his trusted generals, Subutai and Jebe, masters of strategy whose campaigns would send shockwaves across the continent. The initial push came as a reconnaissance mission. Subutai and Jebe, with a force of perhaps 20,000 horsemen, pursued remnants of the Khwarezmian army across the Caucasus Mountains. Along the way, they clashed with Georgian forces, outmaneuvering heavily armoured knights with lightning mobility. Their campaign became a rolling avalanche, devastating Armenia, raiding into the Black Sea steppes, and then colliding with the nomadic Cumans. The Cumans, desperate, fled to their Slavic allies for aid. This drew the Mongols into direct conflict with the principalities of Rus. The climactic moment came in 1223 at the Battle of the Kalka River. A coalition of Russian princes and Cuman allies, numbering perhaps 3 times the Mongol force, faced Subutai's army. Outnumbered but never outmaneuvered, the Mongols feigned retreat, a tactic perfected on the steppe. The Rus pursued, believing victory was at hand, only to be encircled. The battle ended in disaster for the coalition. Chroniclers describe horrific slaughter, the princes captured and executed, their men trampled beneath Mongol hooves. Yet, remarkably, the Mongols did not stay to occupy Rus. Instead, Subutai and Jebe continued their march, raiding into the Crimea before circling back to Mongolia through the Caspian steppes. It was less a conquest than a demonstration, a thunderclap announcing to Europe that a new power had risen in the east. Word of the Mongols' speed and brutality spread across Christendom, sowing both fear and disbelief. To many in Europe, the horsemen seemed less like men and more like a scourge of God, unstoppable and inhuman. For Genghis Khan, these campaigns were invaluable. They mapped new lands, tested European armies, and proved that Mongol reach extended far beyond Asia. The march into Eastern Europe was a warning, one that would not be fully understood until decades later, when Mongol armies returned in force to shatter kingdoms from Poland to Hungary. After years of near-constant campaigning, the Mongol armies had stretched their dominion from the Yellow River to the Caspian Sea. Yet even a conqueror as relentless as Genghis Khan knew that expansion could not proceed without consolidation. By the early 1220s, he returned his attention to Mongolia itself, to the steppes that had shaped him, and to the foundation of the empire that bore his name. The return was not simply a homecoming, but a moment of reorganization. Genghis convened Kurultais, great councils of his nobles and generals, where strategies were debated and new laws were reinforced. He distributed conquered lands and peoples among his sons and trusted commanders, ensuring both loyalty and order. The empire was divided into appanages, yet all owed obedience to the great Khan. It was a delicate balance, granting autonomy to powerful figures while making it clear that ultimate authority flowed only from him. Equally important was the refinement of the yasa, his legal code. Under it, theft, betrayal, and desertion were punished harshly, but loyalty and merit were richly rewarded. These laws were not abstract. They were enforced across the empire's vast distances by appointed officials and military governors. Even in regions thousands of miles from Mongolia, the will of Genghis Khan was felt through this unified system of discipline. He also invested in infrastructure, something rarely associated with nomadic empires. Relay stations and postal routes, known as the Yam, were established across the steppes and beyond, enabling messages to travel at astonishing speed. This network bound the empire together, allowing Genghis to command armies thousands of kilometers apart, with remarkable efficiency. Merchants, too, benefited, as trade along the Silk Road began to flourish under Mongol protection. What had once been a patchwork of dangerous caravan routes was becoming a secure artery of commerce. Culturally, Genghis fostered a curious pragmatism. He welcomed artisans, scribes, and scholars from conquered lands into his service. Muslims, Chinese, Persians, and Turks found places in his administration, their skills strengthening the empire. While his conquests were brutal, His rule was often surprisingly tolerant of religions and local customs, so long as tribute was paid and loyalty sworn. By returning to the steppes, Genghis Khan ensured that the empire did not collapse under the weight of its own success. It was a pause, a tightening of the reins, before the next surge outward. For the Khan, the steppes were not just his homeland. They were the heart that pumped life into an empire stretching across continents. By the mid-1220s, Genghis Khan was already a legend. His empire stretched from the edges of Korea to the shores of the Caspian, and yet he was not finished. The aging conqueror still had unfinished business with Xixia, the Tangut kingdom in northern China, that had once submitted but had grown restless under Mongol domination. When the Tanguts defied his authority and withheld their obligations, Genghis resolved to personally lead a final campaign, a reminder that no betrayal, however small, would go unanswered. The war against Xixia was brutal and swift. Mongol armies laid waste to towns, fields, and irrigation systems, depriving the kingdom of both food and morale. Genghis employed his classic strategy of terror, making examples of resisting settlements so others would crumble without a fight. By 1227, the Tangut capital at Zhongxing was under siege. Facing starvation, the Tanguts attempted to negotiate, but Genghis demanded unconditional surrender. Before terms could be finalized, he fell gravely ill, either from wounds sustained in battle or from injuries suffered in a horse-riding accident. The exact cause remains a mystery, shrouded in legend and speculation. Despite his failing health, Genghis insisted on finishing the war. His generals, honoring his will, pressed on until Xixia was utterly destroyed, its royal family executed, its cities leveled, and its name erased from maps. It was a grim demonstration of Mongol resolve. To defy the Khan was to invite annihilation. Only after victory was assured did Genghis finally succumb to his illness in August 1227, passing away in his camp near the conquered Tangut lands. His death was kept secret for months. The Mongol army continued campaigning as though nothing had changed, ensuring that news of the Khan's passing would not embolden his enemies. When the truth was revealed, the empire did not collapse in chaos. Instead, it transitioned to his heirs with remarkable stability. His son Ogedei was named successor, chosen for his administrative skill and ability to balance competing factions. The final campaigns of Genghis Khan were not just the closing act of one man's life, but a statement of principle. His empire would not tolerate disobedience, and his legacy would be secured in blood and fire. Though he died far from home, the empire he built was stronger than ever, poised to expand even further under his descendants. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, he left behind more than an empire. He left behind a transformation of the world. In just 2 decades, he had turned a collection of feuding nomadic tribes into the largest contiguous empire in history, stretching from the Pacific shores of China to the Caspian Sea. His legacy was written not only in conquest, but in the systems he built, the terror he wielded, and the unexpected stability he created across vast and diverse lands. Strategically, Genghis revolutionized warfare. His mastery of cavalry tactics, use of feigned retreats, and relentless mobility allowed the Mongols to outmaneuver larger, slower armies. He was not afraid to adopt the technologies of his enemies. Siege engines from China, engineers from Persia, and administrators from the Islamic world all found their place in his war machine. By combining steppe ferocity with borrowed innovations, Genghis created a model of adaptive warfare that reshaped how empires fought. His brutality, however, became just as legendary. Entire cities that resisted were annihilated, their populations massacred to instill fear in others. To his enemies, he was a monster. The punishment of God, as one chronicler put it. Yet this ruthlessness had a calculated purpose. It broke resistance before battles were even fought, saving Mongol lives and accelerating conquest. Terror, for Genghis, was a weapon as sharp as any blade, but his empire was not built on fear alone. The Yasa codified law and discipline, ensuring that Mongol soldiers and subjects alike lived under a predictable order. His postal relay system, the Yam, allowed messages and goods to travel astonishing distances with speed. Trade routes, once fractured and dangerous, thrived under Mongol protection, giving rise to what historians later called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. For the first time in centuries, merchants could travel from Europe to China with relative safety, carrying ideas, inventions, and religions alongside silk and spices. The legacy of Genghis Khan is paradoxical. He was both destroyer and unifier, butcher and lawgiver. To those who felt his wrath, he was apocalypse. To his followers, he was a father of nations. His empire did not die with him. Under his sons and grandsons, it would swell to encompass almost all of Eurasia, influencing everything from European politics to Chinese governance. Genghis Khan began as a boy abandoned on the steppe. He ended as the ruler of the largest empire the world has ever seen. His legacy still lingers, in history, in bloodlines, and in the very shape of the modern world. Picture a dusty frontier town at high noon. The streets are empty except for a few horses tied outside wooden storefronts, their tails flicking at flies. Suddenly, you hear the squeak of hinges and the thud of swinging doors, the entrance to the local saloon. For newcomers, those bat-winged doors were more than an entrance. They were a threshold into another world, one buzzing with energy, danger, and possibility. Step inside, and you're immediately hit with the smell. A pungent mix of whiskey, cigar smoke, sweat, and frying meat. The air is thick, hazy with tobacco clouds that hang over the room like a curtain. Wooden floors are worn from countless boots, spurred heels clinking as cowboys stride to the bar. The room is dimly lit, but alive. Glasses clink, voices shout, and the occasional burst of laughter cuts through the chaos. To the weary drifter fresh off the trail, the saloon was a sanctuary. To the townsfolk, it was the beating heart of their community. Saloons weren't just places to drink. They were the first permanent structures to rise in many frontier towns, built even before churches or schools. They offered warmth on freezing nights, shade from blistering afternoons, and companionship in the loneliness of the West. For miners, it was where they spent their gold dust. For ranch hands, it was where they celebrated payday. Even lawmen and outlaws alike found themselves under the same roof, though never without tension. The barkeep was often the quiet ruler of this unruly world. He knew everyone's business, kept the liquor flowing, and occasionally doubled as peacemaker when tempers flared. Behind him stood shelves of whiskey bottles, some genuine, many filled with harsh blends cut with turpentine or watered down to stretch profits. Yet no one complained too loudly. The drink did its job. In one corner, the gaming tables glowed with the promise of fortune. In another, a piano clanked out ragtime tunes, sometimes accompanied by dancing girls who made the saloon more than just a watering hole. Above it all lingered the unspoken truth. Inside these walls, fortunes could be made, reputations ruined, and brawls could erupt without warning. For all its vices and chaos, the saloon was more than a bar. It was a town's social hub, the place where stories began, alliances formed, and legends of the Wild West took root. To push through those swinging doors was to step into the raw, unfiltered spirit of the frontier. If the saloon was the heart of the Wild West, whiskey was its lifeblood. Few drinks carried such weight in frontier culture, and few were consumed with such reckless abandon. A shot of whiskey was more than just a drink. It was courage in a glass, a cure for loneliness, a reward after backbreaking labour, and sometimes the spark that lit a powder keg of violence. But don't picture the smooth amber liquor of today. Frontier whiskey was notoriously rough. Many barrels were filled with raw grain alcohol, barely aged and harsh enough to burn a man's throat with a single gulp. To stretch supplies and increase profit, barkeeps often fortified their stock with kerosene, tobacco juice, gunpowder, or even rattlesnake heads floating in the barrel for supposed medicinal kick. Locals joked that some blends could take the paint off a wagon wheel, yet men lined up for it anyway. After days herding cattle or swinging pickaxes in a mine, no one cared about refinement. They wanted something fast, cheap, and strong. The ritual was simple. A cowboy or prospector would slap a coin on the counter, typically 10 or 15 cents, and the barkeep would slam down a glass. There was no sipping, no swirling for aroma. The shot was thrown back in one motion, grimaces and coughs included, and the empty glass smacked down for a refill. Some men chased it with beer, which was often warm and flat, while others demanded more until their legs gave out, or their tempers snapped. Whiskey also served as social glue. Deals were struck over it, friendships sealed, and rivalries stoked. A quiet bar could turn loud in minutes once the liquor flowed freely. Old-timers claimed you could measure the health of a saloon, not by the weight of its doors or the shine of its floors, but by how quickly a bottle emptied on a Saturday night. Yet whiskey had its darker side. Drunken quarrels often escalated into full-blown brawls, sometimes ending with shattered chairs or smoking pistols. Many a gunfight in frontier towns began with a round too many. Still, despite its dangers, whiskey remained indispensable. In a land of hardship and uncertainty, it was the one constant. In the Wild West saloon, whiskey wasn't just a drink. It was fire, fuel, and sometimes fate in liquid form. If whiskey was the fuel of the saloon, gambling was its heartbeat. Every frontier bar worth its salt had gaming tables, and around them gathered miners fresh from the hills, cowboys with pockets full of wages, and drifters hoping to strike it rich without ever touching a shovel or a herd. The saloon was where fortunes could change in a single hand of cards, or vanish just as quickly. Poker was king. Men hunched over scarred wooden tables, their eyes fixed on hands of five-card draw, brows furrowed beneath wide-brimmed hats. A good poker player could stretch a few dollars into a fortune, provided he kept his nerves steady and his revolver close. Bluffing was an art, but cheating was common. Hidden aces, marked cards, or a partner dealing from the bottom of the deck were constant threats. Getting caught didn't just mean losing your winnings. It could mean facing a bullet before you left the table. But poker wasn't the only game in town. Faro, a fast-paced card game imported from Europe, became wildly popular in the American West. So popular, in fact, that some towns had more faro tables than poker ones. Unlike poker, faro was often run by a designated dealer or banker, making it less about player skill and more about luck, or the honesty of the house. The odds favoured the dealer, and many saloons made their fortunes by running rigged faro games. Still, the thrill kept players coming back. Dice games, roulette wheels, and even impromptu contests, from knife throwing to arm wrestling, filled out the gambling floor. A man could walk in with a week's pay and lose it all before his beer went warm. Others walked out rich, grinning, only to be robbed in the alley by envious losers. The gamblers themselves were larger-than-life figures. Doc Holliday, Wild Bill Hickok, and countless lesser-known sharpers earned their reputations in these smoky rooms. They weren't just players, they were performers, spinning legends with every hand, their exploits retold by wide-eyed patrons long after the cards were swept away. For many, the gambling tables were the true stage of the saloon, places where courage, greed, and luck collided under flickering lamplight. Every shuffle of the deck carried possibility, and every deal carried danger. In the Wild West, fortune was never secure, but inside the saloon, it was always just one hand away. If the gambling tables kept the saloon's heart pumping, music and entertainment gave it soul. The sound of a battered upright piano, half in tune and half in protest, was a fixture in nearly every frontier saloon. Its cheerful clatter cut through the haze of cigar smoke and clinking glasses, carrying with it a promise of distraction from the hardships outside. Whether it was a lively ragtime number, a mournful ballad, or just a drunk pianist pounding keys with more enthusiasm than skill, the music filled the room with life. Often, the piano player wasn't alone. Fiddlers, banjo pickers, or even small travelling bands added variety, turning the saloon into the closest thing to a concert hall most towns ever had. Patrons sang along loudly and badly, their voices slurring with whiskey, their laughter blending with the music until the place itself seemed to vibrate. And then there were the dancing girls, the icons of saloon life. Known variously as saloon girls, soiled doves, or simply entertainers, these women worked as much to keep men spending money as they did to perform. Dressed in bright gowns with feathers, sequins, and rouge, they danced on makeshift stages or wove through the crowd, coaxing cowboys and miners to buy them drinks. For the price of a whiskey, often watered down for the girls, a lonely drifter could enjoy conversation, flirtation, and the fleeting illusion of companionship. Some saloon girls were skilled performers in their own right, able to sing or dance with enough flair to captivate a room. Others were there simply to survive, earning what they could in a world that offered women few opportunities. To many patrons, however, they were as essential to the saloon experience as cards or liquor. Of course, the presence of music and dancing didn't always mean peace. Jealous quarrels between patrons over a girl's attention could escalate quickly, and more than one brawl began with a misplaced word during a waltz. Still, the atmosphere they created was irresistible. For men who had spent weeks on dusty trails or in dark mines, the glow of lamplight, the rustle of skirts, and the rhythm of piano keys were intoxicating reminders that life could be more than toil and dust. Entertainment in the saloon was never polished or refined, but it didn't need to be. It was raw, loud, and alive, exactly like the Wild West itself. For all the music, laughter, and whiskey-fueled cheer, every saloon carried the threat of sudden violence. Beneath the clink of glasses and shuffle of cards, tempers simmered like dynamite waiting for a spark. All it took was a crooked deal, a spilled drink, or a jealous glance at a dancing girl, and the saloon could erupt into chaos. Brawls were the most common form of saloon mayhem. Fists flew, chairs splintered, and bottles shattered as men settled grudges with brute strength. The barkeep might try to break it up with a shotgun under the counter, but often fights spread like wildfire, dragging half the room into the fray. Tables overturned, lamps were smashed, and unlucky gamblers lost not only their wages, but their teeth. To the regulars, a good brawl was almost expected, entertainment as much as a hazard. Yet some confrontations didn't end with bruises and black eyes. In a land where every man carried iron on his hip, disputes often escalated to drawn pistols. The most infamous saloon gunfights entered legend. Wild Bill Hickok was gunned down in Deadwood's No. 10 saloon, while holding what would later be called the dead man's hand. Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp's reputations were cemented not only in dusty streets, but in smoky saloon rooms where bullets flew over poker chips. These violent clashes made saloons dangerous, but also magnetic. Tales of gunfights travelled faster than stagecoaches, drawing gamblers, outlaws, and thrill-seekers who wanted to witness, or survive, the next explosion of violence. The saloon became theatre, and the actors were armed men whose lives balanced on the edge of chance. Lawmen walked a fine line. Many towns had sheriffs or marshals, but even they knew that keeping order in a saloon was like trying to dam a river with bare hands. Some looked the other way, so long as the violence didn't spill into the streets. Others, like Earp in Dodge City, tried to enforce no-guns ordinances, often leading to bloody showdowns themselves. For better or worse, saloons thrived on this volatility. The possibility of sudden violence added to their allure, turning them into both danger zones and arenas of legend. To walk into a Wild West saloon was to step into a place where whiskey, luck, and death mingled freely, and where every night carried the chance of becoming part of history. In the Wild West saloon, the bartender was more than a man pouring drinks. He was the anchor of the entire establishment. Behind his polished bar, or sometimes just a rough plank of wood, he stood like a sentinel, equal parts businessman, entertainer, confidant, and peacekeeper. If the saloon was a ship tossed on waves of whiskey and temper, the bartender was its captain. His duties went far beyond serving liquor. A good barkeep mixed drinks quickly, remembered every regular's preferences, and kept the room humming with energy. He was often the first person a newcomer met when stepping through those swinging doors. A smile, a warning, or a silent nod from the bartender could make the difference between a night of easy drinking or a night that ended with fists and pistols. His reputation could draw men to a saloon just as surely as the gambling tables or piano tunes. But bartenders also walked a fine line. They needed to keep customers drunk enough to spend money, but not so drunk that the saloon burned to the ground in a brawl. Some used tricks to stretch profits, watering down whiskey, reusing beer kegs, or selling rot-gut liquor disguised in fancy bottles. Patrons might complain, but most kept drinking anyway, knowing they had little choice. The bartender also held power in more subtle ways. He overheard secrets whispered over poker hands, caught snippets of business deals, and listened to confessions slurred after midnight. In many frontier towns, the barkeep knew more about its people than the sheriff ever did. This made him both respected and feared. Some bartenders traded information, becoming informal brokers of power in their communities, and when trouble came, the bartender often acted as referee. Many kept a shotgun within reach, not necessarily to use, but to remind rowdy cowboys that there were limits. A slammed bottle, a shouted command, or the sight of steel under the bar could calm a fight before it got out of hand. Still, when violence erupted beyond control, even the most seasoned barkeep sometimes ducked for cover like everyone else. Ultimately, the bartender was the steady hand in a world of chaos. He was the saloon's memory, its manager, and often its soul. Without him, the whiskey stopped flowing, the games slowed down, and the saloon lost its rhythm. In the Wild West, where law was thin and life was cheap, the bartender's word often carried more weight than the sheriff's badge. Though remembered today for whiskey, poker, and brawls, saloons were more than dens of vice. In many frontier towns, they were the closest thing to a town square, the social and political nerve centre where life pulsed day and night. For communities scattered across miles of wilderness, the saloon wasn't just entertainment. It was the hub where people gathered, news travelled, and decisions were made. Miners fresh from the diggings brought their gold dust to the bar, trading it for drinks, supplies, or the company of fellow labourers. Cowboys ended long cattle drives by cashing in their wages, often spending them almost entirely under the saloon roof. Drifters who had no family found in the saloon a place where they could talk, laugh, and at least pretend they belonged. Even respectable townsfolk who might have frowned at the chaos admitted that much of the town's business, whether economic or political, flowed through those swinging doors. The saloon was also the community's newsroom. In a time before telegraphs and newspapers reached every settlement, gossip and rumour spread across bar counters faster than any official announcement. Travellers and salesmen brought tales from distant territories, sheriffs kept their ears open for whispers of outlaws, and prospectors swapped stories of new strikes in the hills. A single conversation in a saloon could set men packing for the next gold rush, or prepare a posse for trouble. Politics thrived there as well. Candidates for sheriff, mayor, or judge bought rounds of drinks to win favour. Deals were brokered over poker tables, and alliances sealed with clinking glasses. In towns without courthouses or proper halls, community meetings were often held right in the saloon, with decisions hammered out between whiskey shots. For better or worse, the saloon was the frontier's parliament. Not all saloons looked the same. Some were small, rough shacks with little more than a bar and a few chairs. Others grew into grand establishments with chandeliers, fine mirrors, and carved woodwork, a symbol that the town had grown prosperous. But whether humble or lavish, every saloon functioned as a lifeline, keeping isolated settlers connected to one another. In a world where loneliness could break a man as surely as hunger, the saloon's role as a gathering place cannot be overstated. It was the stage where news was shared, bonds were forged, and towns carved out identities on the edge of civilization. When people picture saloons, they often imagine a smoky room full of dusty cowboys, gamblers, and gunfighters. Yet women were there too, shaping the saloon's atmosphere and, in many cases, its very survival. Their roles were complex. sometimes glamorous, sometimes tragic, but always central to the world behind those swinging doors. The most visible were the saloon girls, entertainers who sang, danced, and kept men company at the tables. Dressed in bright gowns with feathers in their hair, they stood out in towns where most women wore plain dresses suited for farm or household work. They were hired not simply to amuse, but to keep customers spending. For every drink a cowboy bought for a saloon girl, the house earned extra profit. And often the girl's drink was little more than watered-down liquor or coloured water. To a lonely prospector, the illusion of sharing whiskey and laughter with a woman was worth the price. But these women lived hard lives. Many were far from home, lured west by promises of excitement or driven by poverty. Some earned decent money and even found stability, while others slipped into cycles of exploitation, treated more like property than employees. Respectable society often branded them as soiled doves, and though they brought warmth and life to the saloon, they were rarely welcomed outside it. Not all women in saloons were entertainers, however. Some owned or managed establishments themselves. In mining towns and boom settlements, widows or entrepreneurial women recognized opportunity and ran saloons as businesses, outsmarting competition and turning profits where men failed. These female proprietors proved that saloons were not simply male spaces, but economic engines that women could also control. For many men, saloon girls represented a brief escape from loneliness and the harsh realities of frontier life. A dance, a song, or even a few minutes of conversation softened the edges of isolation. Yet their presence also carried risk. Jealous disputes over a girl's attention were a common cause of fights, and more than one bloody shootout began with a rivalry born over a woman's smile. The saloon was therefore a paradox for women, a place of opportunity, performance, and survival, but also of judgment and danger. They were the colour in a world of dust, the spark in the gloom, and whether celebrated or condemned, they were inseparable from the legend of saloon life. For decades, the saloon stood as the heartbeat of the frontier. It was where fortunes were gambled, feuds exploded, and music spilled into dusty streets. But like the Wild West itself, the age of the saloon could not last forever. As towns grew and civilization followed the railroads, the same forces that brought the saloon to life also pushed it toward decline. The first blow came from respectability. As frontier settlements matured into established towns, churches, schools, and civic halls began to appear, institutions that directly competed with the saloon for influence. Community leaders, particularly women involved in church groups and reform movements, denounced saloons as dens of vice. To them, the saloon symbolized drunkenness, broken families, and lawlessness. They saw its closure as essential to building civilized communities. The temperance movement gained strength in the late 19th century, spreading across the United States. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union painted saloons as threats to morality and order. Campaigns for prohibition, which would eventually triumph nationwide in the early 20th century, targeted saloons as public enemy number one. Already in many territories, strict licensing laws and pressure from reformers made it harder for saloons to operate freely. At the same time, the economy shifted. The Wild West boomtowns that had once supported dozens of saloons dwindled as gold veins ran dry or cattle trails shifted. With fewer transient workers flush with pay to spend recklessly, many saloons simply went out of business. Those that survived often had to adapt, rebranding as restaurants, hotels, or respectable bars to cater to families and a broader clientele. The rise of commercial breweries also changed the saloon landscape. Beer halls sponsored by breweries began replacing the independent whiskey dens, offering a cleaner, more standardized drinking environment. The rough, chaotic saloon gave way to something more regulated, polished, and middle class. By the time Prohibition became law in 1920, the legendary saloon of the frontier was already a dying breed. Its swinging doors, poker tables, and dancing girls belonged more to memory and myth than to reality. Yet its legacy endured. The saloon remains etched into the American imagination as the stage where outlaws and lawmen crossed paths, where cowboys celebrated paydays, and where music and mayhem defined a rougher age. The decline of the saloon marked the taming of the West, but its legends, of whiskey shots, piano tunes and brawls, still echo across history.